Hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name's Megsie, and today I am going to be doing part 2 of my May wrap-up. I read a total of 12 books throughout the month of May, and so I split this video up into 2 parts. I will include the link above if you want to see the first half of the video, but for this video today, I will be doing the next 6 books I read in the month of May. I read a couple nonfiction books that were quite upsetting. I'm still recovering from them, honestly. And then some other hodgepodge of fiction that includes sort of like unhinged women characters and hipster lit. So if you're interested, please stick around and we will get started. As always, the links to every single book, the timestamps will be included down below. The first book I will be discussing in this video that I read, which was like the 7th book I read in May, was a nonfiction, and it was Light in Gaza, Writings Born of Fire by Jehad Abusalim and a few other editors. This was compiled by the American Friends Services Committee, who are the Quakers, and it was published by Haymarket Books. So this was one of the hardest pieces of nonfiction I have ever read. This was compiled and published in 2022, so right before the current genocide. So you have poems, personal essays, academic pieces about Gaza's agricultural life or lack thereof, and architecture and the building and rebuilding of homes, which, if you know the history, this is happens prior to October of 23 quite frequently, with certain aggressions that were in 2008 and 2009, 2012, 2014, 2018, 2021, etc., etc. And so it is basically like an anthology of life, and it's pretty incredible. It is pretty harrowing. I don't even know if that fully describes reading this, and reading it in light of the current genocide and like deliberate starvation it was a lot. I had to balance this with reading fiction because I could not read this all in one sitting, and so it took like the first half of May for me to get through this. So what you get when you read all of this sort of like mosaic of essays is the reality of what the occupation is like in Gaza. I think that we have better testimony of life in the West Bank, but Gaza was deliberately isolated from the rest of the world. And I think it is, when you read this, it is imperative to push back against the Israeli narrative that they left Gaza in 2005 because they moved settlements and settlers out. But what they did, I know. Yes. Free Palestine, free Siberia, free all oppressed people. Can you go away? Thank you. What they did was they imposed a blockade, they imposed militarized border, they controlled all except one, which is on the Egypt side, entry and exit points into and out of Gaza. They monitored the food going in. Everything was monitored going in and out. And there was one essay about, I think, an English teacher who writes to Noam Chomsky, who corresponds with him, and Chomsky sends him some of his books and how long it took to even get those books, and he didn't even get half of them. Just like the daily life of how this was done to deliberately grind down a population's spirit and break them. And even just things of like restrictions on how far out you could fish or where you could farm, or there's no airspace. Actually, they talked about, one Palestinian talks about the constant surveillance of drones flying overhead, monitoring people. I mean, it is absolutely horrifying. It was like reading about a dystopian nightmare that was reality, and this is prior to the genocide. And so I think if like people don't know this history, I didn't know this history. I knew Gaza was like an open air prison, but I didn't know the realities of it. And yeah, so that was mind-blowing to me. And the first essay in here is by Rafat Alarir, who was a famous Palestinian academic and very outspoken about the conditions in Gaza. He was an activist, and he was killed deliberately in an Israeli airstrike at the beginning of this genocide in December of 23. And so reading that in hindsight made this book even harder. I think for me, though, it was very illuminating to me to understand, like, all of the history of Gaza, and I think I have a pretty good understanding of it more so now. But it was just hard. This was hard to like I said, I don't have really words to describe it. And I think just to read about how, you know, they write about like how difficult it is to live under this, and then it just gets worse. And yeah, so I am going to refrain from rating this in this video because I feel that it's kind of weird to rate something like this. It's like rating Anne Frank's diary or something, you know? So if you want to know more about the history of Gaza, if you think you can stomach it, the Gaza Strip specifically, and how we got to this moment, it definitely is a very informative book, but very heartbreaking. Yeah. The next book I finished in the month of May, on a little bit of a lighter note, was My Husband by Maud Ventura, translated from French by Emma Ramadan. This is actually a pretty popular novel, I feel like, on booktube and social media, and it's kind of absurd. When you're reading this novel, you cannot take it so literally. Kind of like you have to suspend your disbelief a little bit. It is about a French woman who she's been married for 15 years. She and her husband have 2 kids, and she is still bespotted with her husband as much as the day when they first began dating. And so the novel, I think, asks the question, what would it be like if you never evolved beyond the honeymoon phase of your relationship? Because I think a lot of us, when you're in a long-term relationship, you tend to romanticize those initial, like, first 6 months or so. And this novel, like, takes that premise and stretches it to the nth degree. What would it be like? I think it would be hell. This protagonist, I don't think she's ever named. Or maybe she is. I don't remember. She literally overanalyzes and scrutinizes every minute detail. Her entire life revolves around her husband and their marriage, and she is very, like, passive aggressive, and every little minor slight that she perceives, she is like, well, I have to punish him. But yet every little, like, a gesture, a glance, she thinks that, like, oh my God, he's gonna divorce me. It's the end of the world. And so the novel it's silly, and it's both, like, lighthearted and yet kind of dark simultaneously. This character is just exhausting, and the novel really examines larger questions, I think, of love and different stages of love. It's really good at illuminating the deep insecurity and anxiety that underpins the infatuation phase that we all, I think, tend to look back on with fondness. And it shows how emotionally fraught that phase is, especially if you have an anxious attachment style like this narrator. And it's also a commentary on gender roles and how women are taught to, like, place the highest value on romantic love, and how that ties into, like, their own value as human beings. And, like, why does that not ring true in the same way for men? There's one sentence in here that stuck with me. It said, this is when she actually, like, she fakes being married. Before she actually married her husband, she wore, like, a fake ring. And she says, I can't explain it, but my fake status as a married woman finally showed the world that my existence had value. So there's a twist at the end, in the epilogue. I'm not really sure how I feel about it, because some people did not like it at all. I don't know, I was kind of neutral about it. Like, I didn't like it necessarily, but I'm not mad about it either. But this novel, it's very, very French. And I can't even really like articulate why, but at times it reminded me of Alain de Botton's Essays in Love, which I have actually mentioned on this channel as like a favorite nonfiction piece. But yeah, overall, I did like this, and I would rate it 4 stars. So the next book I finished in May was The Princess of 72nd Street by Elaine Krauf. This was originally published in 1979, and it was recently reissued last year. And it has an introduction by Melissa Broder, who I have also talked about on this channel. She wrote The Pisces. So this is a very, it's like a novella, I would say. It's about 137 pages, and it's one of those sort of like forgotten, overlooked classics, I think. It's about a young woman named Elaine, who is presumably, although it is not said, bipolar. And she lives in the Upper West Side in the 1970s in New York City. And she has these manic episodes that she refers to as radiances, where she believes that she is the princess of a kingdom. She is Princess Esmeralda, and all the people who live within this certain strip on West 72nd Street are her subjects of her kingdom. And the novel, I guess, novella, is sort of like a metaphor for reclaiming mental illness, I want to say. Like, when Ellen is Esmeralda, she almost like becomes this superhero in a sense, and men, they want to like control her more. I mean, you see where she has these manic episodes where she dresses up in these extremely absurd, outlandish outfits, and she goes and just like picks up random men and brings them home, and then she doesn't remember sleeping with them. It was a really interesting way of describing bipolar disorder. Reading it, though, it is very stream of consciousness, and it honestly did give me a headache at times. I think maybe that was the point. And yeah, it's just like her life and how she goes through these like different bipolar and manic episodes. Although I don't know, I did have questions because I'm not sure, I don't feel like this is completely true to life of someone with bipolar disorder. I mean, I am not bipolar. I do know some people who are, because the character does seem to still sort of harbor this delusion that she is a princess even when she is not manic. And so I don't know if there was supposed to be like a comorbid disorder underneath, or, you know, I don't know. I think this, I could see why people see it as like a feminist novel in terms of agency and the pushing back against the medical misogyny that is inherent within mental health treatments. But at the same time, I don't know if at times the book veers into the territory of romanticizing mental illness, because, well, I can appreciate why it kind of implies that, like, she has more agency or superpowers. That's not, like, really, when you're mentally ill, you don't feel empowered. Like, I don't think that having a psychotic episode or a manic episode or whatever you want to call it is like intentionally subversive. I think it's actually quite terrifying. So I wasn't sure what this book was like really trying to say. I feel like the themes kind of got a little muddled. A lot of people said the book was like quite progressive and ahead of its time in terms of how she, in passing, mentions gay people and trans people. But there was like a weird section that she like dresses up as an Arab woman, and although she has a bindi on, and she like meets up with this Iraqi man wearing a turban, and they go to like a nightclub and she belly dances and she feels so empowered. And it was honestly kind of gross and just like lent itself to like weird Orientalism fetishizing tropes. I was like, okay, this is, I mean, I get it. It was written in the late 70s, but I was kind of a little bit like repulsed by that. I think I would rate this book like maybe 3.5 to 4 stars. I do think it was unique and interesting. It did leave me with a lot of like questions though about it. But I do like snapshots of New York City in the 1970s. So yeah. The next book I finished in the month of May was One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This by Omar Akkad. I talked about this in my 2025 releases that I wanted to read. This was like sticking your head in a pool of water and not coming up for air and being completely black-pilled. I mean, this was also very intense. I should not have read this like within a short time frame of the other Gaza book, because this put me in a funk. I swear, I'm like still recovering. I am still recovering. This book was good. It is a little different though than what I thought. So Omar Akkad is a war journalist, and he covered, I think, the Iraq War. He is Egyptian. He was raised in Qatar, and then his family moved to Canada, and then later he lives now in the United States in the Pacific Northwest. And it's about the Gaza genocide, but it is more infused with Al-Akkad's time as a war correspondent and media narratives, and I guess you could say like the sort of political and media establishment support for the war on terror. And he kind of links that to the genocide in Gaza, which, yes, that is part of it, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. So it's interspersed like with his time, like not just as a war correspondent, but also him growing up in Qatar and living under a repressive Gulf state, and how he always looked to the West as this beacon of freedom and democracy. And then, slowly over time, as he became disillusioned with like the Iraq War and now finally the genocide, and essentially, I guess you could say it is his breakup letter to the West, but it is more him also pointing out the hypocrisy within liberalism, because this was funded by a Democratic administration. And so he points out like how I think a lot of people, particularly people who are liberal, like centrist to like liberal, left of center, they tend to, it's beyond just virtue signaling, but like it's easy for people to be against something when that horror has long since passed. And it's harder for people, I think, to stand up in the moment and speak out against atrocities that are happening. And so that's a lot about what this book goes into. I mean, I did think that there were a lot of great lines, and I did really tab this. And if I went through every single line I read, I tabbed, we would be here all day. I do wish, though, that he would have gone a little bit more into the history. Again, I understand this is not like a Rashid Khalidi book, but I do, like I said, I think that is very, very important. And I do think that, like, the dehumanization specifically, not just of Arabs or people in the Middle East, but, like, specifically Palestinians, it goes beyond, I think, just, like, anti-Arab racism or Islamophobia. It's something that is much deeper and has been going on for a long, long period of time, decades. And I think reading that back to back with the Gaza book, how were people fine with an open air prison? Do you know what I mean? So I don't know if he really traces, like, in a concrete way, how we in the Western world were, like, primed essentially to accept genocide. I don't know if it, I think it, like I said, it goes back beyond just like the 2000s war on terror, the dehumanization of Palestinians. So, I mean, I would rate this book 4.5 stars. It's not quite what I expected, and it did feel at times kind of incomplete because I think it was sort of rushed out, and like this book ends, I think, like it goes probably as far as like July 2024 when Biden finally steps down. And then Kamala Harris taking the campaign, that's a whole other thing. But I felt like there were certain things that, like I said, he could have elaborated on. He talks about, like, people will say, oh, where is the Palestinian Martin Luther King Jr. or the Nelson Mandela? And he didn't say this, and I wish he would have, but, like, they were not popular at the time here in the West. Like, MLK, when he died, he had like a 25% approval rating from white Americans. And Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist by the United States until 2008. And their thoughts, both these two figures who were seen as these peace-loving, kind men, they had much more nuanced views on violence and nonviolence as terms of resistance. So, you know, I kind of wish he would have, like I said, there are certain things, including the history, I wish he would have gone into a little bit deeper. But this book did make me cry. And like I said, this and the Light in Gaza book, I like spiraled. I'm still recovering. I know. And I know that sounds like such a privileged Western thing to say. But yeah, read with caution. But yeah, I rated it 4.5 stars. The next book I finished in the month of May was The Girl in the Flammable Skirt by Aimee Bender. This is definitely a blast from the past. Aimee Bender was pretty well known in the 2000s as a writer, and I remember seeing this cover and the title. I picked this up in a little lending library, and it brought back a lot of memories. It was published in 1999. So this is a collection of short stories that uses elements of magical realism and almost like surrealism, like absurdity, to talk about people who are living on the margins of society and who are like seeking deeper connections, things outside themselves. And I realized that description sounds a lot like Ottessa Moshfegh's Homesick for Another World, which I reviewed in my other May video. And when I was reading this, I actually could see some influence, I think, that Aimee Bender had on someone like Moshfegh. Besides what I just said, like people seeking deeper connections. The only difference, though, is that Moshfegh is focused more on like grossness and almost just like bodily function ickiness, whereas Bender traffics more, like I said, in magical realism and almost surrealism. So, like a lot of short story collections, this was like hit or miss for me. I am starting to wonder if really short story collections are my jam, because it's very, very hard for me to say, yeah, like this is a solid collection of short stories. I will generally have a couple stories I really like, a couple stories I'm like, what the hell was this? And then the bulk of them are just like, meh, forgettable. The stories I did like were more in the beginning of the collection, actually. Call My Name, What You Left in the Ditch, and Quiet Please. Call My Name is about this heiress who, she's wearing this very like fancy dress, and I think it takes place in Philly, actually, and she follows a man off of like the L train in Philly, and she like follows him to her apartment and to his apartment, and she like doesn't leave him alone. And he's like, what are you, a prostitute? It was, there's definitely sometimes like a little bit of black humor here. What You Left in the Ditch is about a man who returns from the war and he's missing his lips, and his wife is so disgusted by that she ends up pining for a man who works, a young guy who works at the local supermarket. Quiet Please is about a librarian who's dealing with grief, and she has sex with all these different men that come into the library. There's definitely like a lot of sex, is definitely like sex and death, and like sex as like a means of escape and connection is definitely like a common theme in a lot of these work. Like I said, those are the ones that stood out to me, but like overall it was just like a hit or miss collection. Yeah, so if you want like weird women writers from like a couple decades ago, I'd recommend it, but it was just like meh, it was okay. It was 3 stars. And the last book I finished in the month of May was Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. This book was published last year, and it literally was everywhere, I think including on like Best Books of the Year by the New York Times. I enjoyed this as a piece of entertainment, but I don't think I found it as profound or earth-shattering as some people are making it out to be. It definitely comes across as very navel-gazing millennial hipster that is self-aware that they are a millennial hipster navel-gazer, but continues to do it, if that makes sense. It's also very meta, like a writer writing about writing in a way that reminded me of RF Kuang's Yellowface. So the story is about an Iranian-American man named Cyrus who is a struggling alcoholic, addict, and his mother was shot down by the U.S. Navy. This is a true story in 1988. The U.S. Navy shot down an Iranian passenger plane and was just like, oh, oops. And his mother was killed that way. And he was just a little baby at the time, and he and his dad moved to the States, and he's still struggling to, like, reconcile with this missing hole that was his mother's death in his life, as well as struggling with addiction and, you know, staying sober, as well as being a poet and writing and, you know, searching for the meaning of life and all that, as well as, like, questions of, like, Iranian identity. And so the plot is really a friend of his mentions this Iranian artist who is having this sort of like live galley where she is dying of cancer in this Brooklyn art museum. And it's like this interactive galley where she is refusing treatment and she will sit and talk with people if they want to come and talk to her about death and facing mortality and all of that stuff. And so he travels to Brooklyn to meet up with her. That's essentially like the plot of the story. There are a lot of different like POV points, which was one thing I wasn't like super keen on. I could understand why it was done for certain characters, but there were certain characters I found it unnecessary, and I kind of just wanted to stay more in Cyrus's point of view. I think the parts that were the best, were the strongest, was when he was writing about addiction and what does it mean to like you're still in recovery, and how do you like restructure your entire world when such a central part, the use of a substance, is taken out. And I thought those passages were pretty profound and well written. There were a couple times though when I wasn't sure about like some of his similes. They were like there were a couple times where it didn't quite land. Like it wasn't purple prose, but I was like, I don't know if that really works. I think it was good. I enjoyed it, like I said, but it is like very, very millennial, hipster, self-aware, and I feel like that's like a trend, and that's been a decent amount of like books I've read. So yeah, there is a twist too, which I think is somewhat obvious, but yeah, it's fine. I thought it was a decent book, and I would rate it 4 stars. So if you are here still at the end of this video, thank you so much. Please let me know in the comments down below what books you read in May that you enjoyed, didn't enjoy, if you've read any of the 6 books that I mentioned in this video. Yeah, please comment, like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.